Good morning, everyone. Hope your Saturday is off to a good start. Thank you for joining us for part of it. My name is Amber Stinger, and I'm president of the League of Women Voters of Johnson County. The League is proud to be nonpartisan, neither supporting nor opposing candidates or political parties at any level of government. Today, we continue our efforts to educate and engage voters, one of the primary reasons the League of Women Voters was founded more than 100 years ago. In this world of rampant misinformation and disinformation, getting the facts can be challenging. That's why we are grateful to our esteemed panelists today for taking the time to share their knowledge and expertise with us. Here's our plan for today. In the first hour, our panelists will discuss critical race theory, what it is and what it is not. Following that, they will take some of your questions. Then we'll move right into a few updates, including one about redistricting. We'll end the event with a few organizational announcements. To help the event run smoothly, we want to go over a few Zoom tips, of course. So please use the chat box to ask questions. We've set the chat options so that only the panelists will see your questions and comments. Once the panel discussion begins, we recommend that you watch in gallery view. You can switch the layout of your screen by clicking view on the top right corner and selecting gallery. Click on the chat icon in your controls at the bottom of the screen to get the chat box to appear. If you are using a tablet or phone, you may have to tap the more button to get the chat box option. Also, the program will be recorded and posted to our YouTube channel in the next few days. Now I'm delighted to introduce Janet Milkovich. Janet is the kind of person who has never met a stranger, which is why she is so effective in her role as vice president and director of our programs. Creating these programs requires a lot of work. Janet researches the topics, finds the best people to speak on the issue, and then talks one-on-one and collectively with the panelists to create the relationships needed to have a lively discussion. It's because of her that we've been able to offer quality programs this year. So thank you, Janet, and now I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Amber. I'm so excited to be here today for this topic. I'm grateful that this is a respectful and safe space for us to discuss what is being said about critical race theory. Together, our panelists and the League are committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion, both in principle and in practice. And together, we advocate for policymakers to create a more perfect democracy. The League supports the teaching of a culturally inclusive curriculum that includes instruction to Black, Brown, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian, feminist, and queer American history. We support an equitable quality public education for every student. A League member recently said that unless the League provides accurate information on topics such as critical race theory, people are likely to hear and believe the loudest voices. Learning the facts can only make us a better people and a better country. Our panelists today are going to lead us through this important conversation. We are so glad that you are all here so we can learn together. So introducing Marais Rose William. Marais is a reporter for the Kansas City Star. Her series, The Truth in Black and White, recently received a citation for excellence in journalism from the Society of Professional Journalists. Marais was an education writer for years and is now on the Kansas City Star editorial board. She closely follows legislation around the country about critical race theory. Marais, thank you so much for being with us today. I just can't wait to hear what you have to say. I'd also like to introduce Tyler. Tyler spent 20 years in education. He was a teacher and a principal and also served in higher education. He now works for the United Methodist Foundation. I came across an editorial that Tyler wrote in the Star back in July 28th that really grabbed my attention so much I cut it out and added it to my library. One of his quotes that really resonated with me is, "I hope we don't allow a political hot button issue like fear of an honest look at our history to be used to divide us in an effort to secure partisan votes." Linnea McKenzie with the Advocacy and Awareness Group of Johnson County is unable to be our moderator today due to a last-minute work conflict. So once again, here I am. So welcome to our speakers, our panelists. Tyler, you can unmute yourself anytime here. So we have divided this 1 hour conversation into 2 parts. We're going to be speaking about critical race theory as it relates to education and critical race theory, how it relates to legislation. So our first section will be on education, and Tyler and Murray, you're both welcome to answer at any time. So just to start with a basic, critical race theory does not refer to an actual school curriculum, but instead to an academic concept. In fact, wasn't critical race theory rooted in law?
So yeah, I'd say it's right, Janet. Specifically schools of law and law schools. According to what I've read and what I found, Derek Bell is kind of credited as the founder of critical race theory, Harvard law professor. Maybe to start with the definition, and Murray, I'd be happy to see if I didn't actually test this, but see if you agree with this definition. That critical race theory is a body of legal scholarship and an academic movement of U.S. civil rights scholars and activists who actively seek to critically examine the intersection of race and U.S. law and the challenge of mainstream American civil rights approaches to racial justice. So it looks at that intersection, how does our history, how does this come together in an intersection? And, just like put like a little bit of context on here, I'm sure Ray's going to jump in as well. We have in this country, we have had slaves in our country. We had slaves in our country, at least since 1654. 1654, first documented slave on American soil that I got to find in Virginia. Now we've had slaves in North America since at least 1619. Black folks were enslaved by white folks at least since 1455. So I think, when they look at critical race theory, I think, the founders are looking at and saying, okay, do over 500 years of oppression, suppression, do 500 years of thinking less than, does that somehow bleed over into law and into practice? And it manifests itself quite well, right? I mean, we look at our stuff. Why do we have an 8-mile wall in Detroit? Well, we have that wall because we wanted to build a division between a white neighborhood and a black neighborhood. Why do we have, as John Mellencamp says in the Pink Houses, why is that black man looking at an interstate front yard? Because we weren't going to run the interstate through my front yard, right? That was going to devalue my property. So how does it look? So that's what critical race theory basically does, in my opinion. How does this attitude towards a group of people show up in law?
Okay, thank you. And
I just wanted to jump in that critical race theory is an analysis, right? It is an analysis of how the oppression of African American or any people, but particularly African American, and slavery, and how that trickled down to infiltrate into the way laws were written, the way laws were interpreted, and how it impacts our lives today. So when we start to think about, where we are today, the fact that we're even having this conversation, how much of a role does slavery and the moment that people of color, Black people, were brought to this country, how they were received in this country, how does that impact where we are today and how we got here? That's what critical race theory is. It is taking a look, it is an analysis, and it is a deep theoretical analysis that is very academic. And when I say academic, at a very high level of academics, looking back on how these things impact the laws that were written and how they were interpreted and how they impacted a people. And when I say a people, I don't mean just a people of color, but also how they impacted white people as a result. And that's what critical race theory is. It is not a curriculum for how students are taught in a classroom of, 8th graders. That is not what critical race theory is. However, it has been co-opted and given an incorrect definition and used in a way that has not been productive, I don't think. And so it's just because there's not a really strong knowledge about what critical race theory really is, and misinterpretation and a mischaracterization of what critical race theory is. Now, you can call what people are talking about these days anything else, but it is not critical race theory.
That's a really good point. And oftentimes we don't even address the word theory, which goes back to what you were both saying.
Right.
So the Kansas Education Commissioner, Randy Watson, released this statement. He said, the standard of which Kansas schools are required to teach have always been developed by Kansas teachers. It has never, ever included critical race theory, nor does it today. So my question for you two is, does this mean the American history curriculum does not include information about how the country's economy was built on slavery?
I think that there is some of that, but it doesn't go, there's not enough of it. I mean, think about some of the things that even when I was in school, right? And it hasn't changed all that much, and that's kind of a problem. Some of the things that I did not learn when I was in school, right? One thing that we've all talked about that a lot of people have been talking about this year is take the Tulsa riots as an example. Right? So I never learned anything about that when I was in school. I don't know about either of you, but it was not part of what I was taught. And it's really important information for young people to have. I never learned anything about that. So yes, there is mention of slavery, but I've talked to my children about it because I want to know, specifically what it is that they were learning about slavery, because of course that's something that we supplement here in our home and talk about. And, they're taught that there were slaves, but how were slaves treated? The truth about how slaves were treated. I mean, all of those kinds of things need to be brought into the conversation more. So there needs to be more discussion about what happened with slavery, what it meant. And that does not make it critical race theory. Going in depth about the history of slavery in this country, and even talking to some degree about how that impacts us or what we think about it today is not critical race theory. It's just expanding on our knowledge about what slavery was, and not just slavery. It's not just slavery. We also have to talk about the history of Black Americans and the positive impacts that they've had on this country, their role in the development of this country. The history of Black Americans is more than Martin Luther King or Rosa Parks or Madam C.J. Walker, for that fact, because we do learn about those folks. There's so much more rich history that we're leaving out for fear of, I don't even know what the fear is, but so I just wanted to expand a little bit more, Janet. There's something I wanted to read. There is the legislation, Missouri legislators have proposed legislation to ban critical race theory. And I think what would help us here is to understand how they define it in the legislation, right? So in the legislation, they talk about banning critical race theory, and they say that critical race theory shall include any curriculum that does any of the following: identifies people or groups of people, entities, or institutions in the United States as inherently, immutably, or systemically sexist, racist, anti-LGBT, bigoted, biased, privileged, or oppressed. Well, does that, so if that's what they want to ban, any discussion of any of those things. So that means that even if we're going to talk about the civil rights movement, right? We're going to talk about the civil rights movement as a very positive thing, a thing of change. But why was there a civil rights movement? Why was there a need for a civil rights movement? Can you actually teach children about the civil rights movement without telling them that African Americans had been oppressed and had been defined of various rights? So that negates that. I mean, it's just talking about our history in its truest sense is what is happening in schools and what teachers want to do more of. They are starved to do more. I talk to teachers all the time, and they're always telling me, kids come to me with these questions, and I'm afraid to talk to them, or I don't know how to talk to them. I need more training on how to talk to them. We have to expand our knowledge of history, not reduce it. I know that was a long answer, but
that was a great answer. Thank you. It's so comprehensive, and I want to hear Tyler's take on this.
Yeah, I think Murray brings out really good points, and one of those being critical race theory and the history of BIPOC people is not the same, and we need more history about BIPOC people in this nation. I mean, we need more of that, but that doesn't mean that it makes it critical race theory and it's used as something that should cause fear amongst us. So I agree with you absolutely. And when you have a definition like the one that Missouri is using, this is the League of Women Voters, right? So I don't think there is a thing such as critical gender theory. But tell me, as a woman, do you think somehow the treatment of women throughout the history of time has provided opportunities for you to be subjected to male dominance? Do you think it's been harder for women to take CEO roles and to advance professionally than it has for men? I mean, all of that history has consequences, and it doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that because the history is there that it makes the current people bad. It just means, hey, we have to address it. And that's what I think's been so tricky on this thing. The binary nature of racism. We know as a country that racism is bad and anti-racism is good. So I don't want to be bad, and I don't want to be labeled as bad. But I also, we have to understand that it's not that simple. There's nuances. And when we really take a close look, and that's what I think critical race theory does. And again, like Murray said, that's a deep academic concept that's well beyond the grasp of most junior and high school level kind of students. But we have to understand, where's the history at? And what has that history led to? And we have to do a better job of understanding that history in order to do that. Part of white privilege is that I get to read about our history and see people that look like me that contributed to the greatness of the country. That's the way history is written. My BIPOC brothers and sisters don't have a chance to see that, and we've got to do a better job of addressing that.
But not only do your Black brothers and sisters not get a chance to see that, neither do your white brothers and sisters get a chance to see that. And that is a problem. And that's what teachers are concerned about. They're concerned that, we're failing to show our students that people of all races and colors and creeds contributed to the beauty of this country. And the only way to do that is to teach the whole of history, all aspects of it, so that we can see from whence we came and what we strove to become, right? So, I mean, one of the things that I found really interesting, and I was doing some reading, and I was reading back on what was happening in Kansas with this critical race theory legislation. While Missouri has it written and has brought it forward, Kansas has proposed that they are going to write legislation to ban critical race theory. And the senator, her name is Karen, I wrote it down, I wanted to remember her name. Oh, I can't remember her name. Well, the senator that is proposing to write the critical race theory, she says, one of the things she says is at the end of her whole spiel on why she wants to ban critical race theory and why it needs to be banned, because it's going to hurt children, it's going to polarize us, it's going to make them feel bad about themselves. And then she goes on to say, we need to understand our history so that we can move forward in a positive way. It's so contradictory to what is proposed. She's right about that. We do need to understand our history, all of it, the good, the bad, and the ugly, so that we can develop an understanding of all of us as a people to move forward. And it just bothers me that the legislation limits the ability to talk about our history, and not just Black history, as I read to you. That would mean that we couldn't talk about women's suffrage, right? Because women definitely were oppressed. There was bias against women and so if we can't talk about anything that deals with bias against any people by another people, which is what it says, then we can't talk about women's suffrage.
So it's going to be a big hole in our history. And
Yes.
it was Senator Karen Tyson that you're referring to with that. So it said that she is going to pre-file legislation to ban CRT. So about teachers, excuse me, Kansas teachers follow a pre-approved curriculum, right?
Yes.
So how do teachers currently, with all of this controversy on the table, how do teachers answer discussions about race and oppression? And are they being asked to silence students who have questions?
They haven't been asked to silence students yet, but that is what the legislation would have them do, because if a school is found, or a teacher is found to be teaching anything that would be, based on the legislation, would be considered critical race theory as defined in the legislation, that district, I think they're given a warning initially, and then secondly, they could be sanctioned by federal dollars. So it would be very detrimental to a school or a classroom or a teacher to do that. But what teachers are telling me is they're very frustrated, because our kids are really smart. And given where we are in this country with this reckoning on race that's happening, and all that happened in 2020, students do come to teachers and to classrooms with many questions about race and where we are with race and how we got here and implications about race, right? And teachers want to follow the lead of their students, and they want to be prepared to do that. They want to get training on how to address issues of race, and they're not getting that, and so they're puzzled really with how they will handle, or how they should handle, when a student comes in and wants to talk about race. And it's obviously something that students are aware of, but they do not have enough information to process what these questions, and neither do the teachers, because they weren't taught it either. So I mean, it's almost like there needs to be some type of professional development that helps teachers to prepare themselves for discussing these issues. And kids have access to things like this discussion we're having today. And if they're accessing it, then they might have questions that they want to bring to their classroom. I heard this discussion about critical race theory, teacher. What are they talking about? What does this mean? What am I not being taught? So yeah.
Thank you. That's a really good point. Tyler, do you have anything to add to that as a former teacher?
That's a good answer, obviously, and I agree with 100%. I think one thing that it would maybe be helpful in some ways. One is that the Kansas curriculum standards, and I think one of the things that folks that use CRT as a way to kind of bash the other side as a political football is that, our curriculum is full of this. And it's not fun reading, but it's available online. Anybody who wants to go to the Kansas curricular standards, it's available online. And I'm not going to tell you it's the most exciting things to read. You're probably not going to do it in your next book club. Oh, have you gotten to 7th grade language arts standards? That's some pretty good stuff. But I'll guarantee though that when we actually read what's in there, it's not scary. And I think the other thing is one of the things that is an outcome for education that our employers are looking for are not just knowledge about like things that have happened, but critical thinking skills.
Right. And
what helps a teacher more than to take a student's interest and then to have a discussion on that forces them to think critically, to analyze information, to read things, to dissect where bias is on either side of things. That's rich content that can be utilized in any profession that we have, because that's what we need to have. We need to have people that are thinking critically and not just regurgitating things that they're fed, in a curriculum. So it's such an opportunity to talk about things. But I think the danger is if teachers do feel like if I do that, I'm subject to being disciplined, I'm subject to being fired, I'm subject to being sued. By all means, that's going to squash that rich opportunity to have a genuine and authentic conversation with students.
Yeah, Tyler, don't they call that and this is a concept that's happening in school for several years now, is student-driven conversations, right? This student-driven lessons where they allow the students to come to the classroom with things they want to discuss, things that are on their mind. So this whole idea of student-driven lessons. And that's
where they are and build from there.
Yeah, exactly. A college professor told me she's in the history department. And she said their whole department is just kind of waiting to see, do we have to change our curriculum based on if legislation in Missouri or, in Kansas, the outcome of that. So here's another way to look at it. What are the benefits of culturally inclusive history in our curriculum? And culturally, again, that's a broad description that Tyler, you referred to. I remember when women's rights really came to the forefront for me in the 70s. I thought we'd have it all figured out by now, but it's an ongoing process. And that's how I feel about this discussion we're having today. So what are the benefits to all of us for culturally inclusive history curriculum?
I think a few things come to mind. It gives us one perspective beyond our own experience. Typically, that perspective beyond our own experience provides empathy for others. It gives us understanding and it humanizes other people. The idea that answers seem so easy the further we are from problems. And the further away we are, the easier the answers seem, right? Well, when it comes to how we have dealt with race and gender and these kinds of topics in our country, that is not a topic that we can see from a distance. We've got to get up close and personal with it. And as we get up close and personal and face to face with it, we discover, one, it's not nearly as easy to solve as we can, as it seems, right? I mean, why didn't passing the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act work? Well, because systemically, there were other issues. Within the culture, there were other issues that led to those things not being implemented as designed and being routed around, and folks in power being able to get around those rules, laws, and regulations. So I think that's just that nature of understanding others, empathizing where they come from, starting where they are, having a face-to-face, genuine conversation with them. I think that's critical.
Yeah, I mean, how many times have you talked with somebody, or you had a particular thought about the way life is, or how easy something might be, until you meet someone who comes from a different place and who deals with that issue in a completely different way. I'm trying to remember what my mom used to tell me, because it was, it was something along, maybe either of you know this expression, but she was like, I thought that reading was so easy until I met someone with no eyes, right? Or walking was easy until I met a man who had no feet. I understood how the challenges of that individual until we meet each other where we are and discuss that and understand where they're coming from, we can't possibly understand what they're going through or what it took for them to get there. And when we do, I always say, when we know better, we do better. We behave better. And the only way you're going to know is to having that, what Tyler was talking about, that face-to-face, that connection and conversation and discussion and learning about other cultures. And then you understand the individuals that you sit next to you in the classroom, right? Better, and understand, and you don't say things that are hurtful, because you understand that they're hurtful and why they are hurtful. If you understand the implications of picking cotton and what that meant for African Americans and how painful a thing that is, you don't make a homecoming sign that says, if I were Black, I'd be picking cotton, but I'm white, so I'm picking you. So that's where culture knowledge comes in. And that happened, right?
Yep.
So that's why it's important. That's a benefit.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's why it's important to understand culture,
Awareness, right?
Absolutely.
Being aware. I mean, it's so important. I used to teach To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee, and Atticus Finch teaches Scout a lesson. Never judge a person until you walk a mile in that person's shoes. Get up close and personal. I'm really thrilled with the work that StoryCorps is doing in a project called One Small Step, where they intentionally pair up two individuals who are very different to have a conversation. So they'll look at a solid Republican and a solid Democrat, whatever it might be, whatever differences it is, putting those two people in a conversation. Because the theory is, the closer you are to somebody, the less likely you are going to be able to judge them and judge them in a harsh manner. I think we need a lot more of that, and that curriculum certainly offers opportunities to grow awareness and grow empathy.
I also think that when two people who are seemingly so very different in their thinking and their appearance and their backgrounds, seemingly so, once they come together and have a discussion, they will find so many things they have in common, right? They will, and that commonality will bind people. It unites people. We like to be with people who are like ourselves or think like us, right? And so when you bring people together and you have a discussion of cultures, and the benefit is that we become closer, because one of the things, I was going to write a book, Things My Mama Used to Say. And I started talking to some friends of mine in this business about things my mama used to say. And you know what they started saying to me? Oh, my mama said that too. Or my mama said that too, but she said it like this. And these were people from all walks of life, all different colors. And it's amazing how we still had so much in common. And that's why sharing your culture and where you come from, you find that there's so many things in common, that we are so much more alike than we are different.
You all are very inspiring, and we're going to tackle one more question. A former Kansas governor who recently dropped out of the current race for governor is quoted as saying that instead of focusing on divisive lesson plans, schools and educators should focus on restoring patriotic education. He suggested that exploring critical race theory in the classroom would lead young children to hating the US. How do you respond to that comment? I guess you know my thoughts by the way I asked the question.
Well, okay. So when I look at my children, I love them unconditionally. They have faults. I know what those faults are. I recognize those faults, but I don't hate them because of it. What I also know is things that they have overcome and how they have grown from the bad decisions and choices that they may have made. And that's how I look at critical race theory. I know that's very simplistic, but what I'm saying is that you don't teach our history, the good, the bad, and the ugly of our history, without also teaching how we have overcome, how we have grown. And that's what you love. That's patriotism, loving the country despite the mistakes that have been made. You love the country not because it made the mistakes, but because it grew from them, because it continues to grow, because it allows for growth. And that's part of the lesson as well. But you don't ignore it, and you don't pretend that it never happened. Real patriotism is loving your country in spite of its faults. That's real patriotism. When you can love a country, even though mistakes were made, that's real patriotism, in my view. That's my opinion. But I'm an opinion writer, so that's
Well, absolutely. I mean, it's exactly that. And our country was founded on values like freedom, justice, and liberty, right? That's our standards. And it's not freedom and justice and liberty for a select few. It's freedom, justice, and liberty for everybody. So let's have a good conversation, and let's talk about how do we get even better. You know, we have made progress as a people. We have come a ways. We still have a ways to go. We have not arrived. This is a journey. This is not a race, but it needs to have progress, though. And the minute we start thinking this is done, now we can move on, we've done ourselves a big disservice. So as long as we have people that are not experiencing the kind of life that we want them to experience as Americans, because we have a standard there, right? We have an idea, we have an ideal. We're proud of our country, and we want people to have that American dream. So as long as there's people that can't get there because of various things that we have that keep them from getting there, let's push towards that. And I think Murray is exactly right. What's more patriotic than saying, yeah, we love our country because this is the place that we can do it. And yeah, we've got to solve some problems, but we never solve problems by not addressing them.
Oh, I feel inspired every time you two answer a question. It's like I'm taking it all in and forgetting that I'm supposed to ask the questions too. So we're going to move to section 2 about legislation, and then we'll do our best to come back to questions that are being posed on chat. But I have noticed that people are very in tune to what you're both saying. They love that we're talking about patriotism. They love talking about they just love hearing what can we do and why is this not the big bad wolf that it's portrayed to be. So let's talk a little bit about legislation. Tyler, you spent a lot of time lobbying. Murray, you've covered legislators for a long time. I spent years as a lobbyist. both in Washington, D.C. and Illinois. So I like this information. I like this kind of topic too. But we have people running for elective office in Kansas and Missouri that have signed pledges to ban critical race theory from being taught in school. But as we know, it's not taught in school. So what are they banning? What are these candidates banning and why?
I don't think they know what they're banning. And that's a problem. I don't think they understand what they're banning because the definition that has been given to critical race theory, one, is not critical race theory. And if they pay attention, which we too often do not. I can't even tell you how many times I get people screaming at me for something I've written and they've only read the headline. And then once I have a discussion with them about what's actually in the story, they go, oh, well, I'm not upset about that. So I think that many of these legislators, they're not banning critical race theory because what is in the legislation is not critical race theory. And if they pay attention, what they're actually banning is any teaching about, as we discussed before, women's suffrage, the details about, how we got to the civil rights movement and why we got there. Do they really want to ban any discussion of that? Are they sure? And if they do, what is that saying about, who they are and what they really are about? How many parents would say, we don't want you teaching our children about women's suffrage and how we got there? We don't want you teaching our children about civil rights and why we got and how we got there. So my answer to the question, Janet, is I do not believe, and that's my optimistic personality. I do not believe that many of these legislators truly understand what it is they are actually banning because they do not understand the concept to begin with.
So let's take a field trip to the state capitol. You and the league, let's go.
Yeah.
Tyler, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely say that this issue is used as gamemanship. I think there's two ways you win an election. You either unify enough people to come alongside you and vote for you, or you divide people in such a way that you hope that your division beats the other division. And that's the way you win an election. And the way CRT is used right now is a way to cultivate fear. It sounds scary. It sounds like it's going to make my kid feel less than. It's going to make your kid feel less than. It's going to challenge these American ideals that we have. So aren't you scared of that? And because you're scared, I, as your politician, can be your savior. I can be your superhero. And I'm going to squash this fear by passing this law. So I think the whole point of this conversation is this is such a rich topic that we need as an American people to talk about. We have to talk about our heritage. We have to talk about where we've come from, where we've been, and we have to have an understanding of that. And to have it reduced to something that makes some people feel uncomfortable and that be identified as, if I'm uncomfortable, it's bad. Well, why is it bad to be uncomfortable? I think that a lot of folks in skin colors different than mine have been uncomfortable for a long time. So let's identify with that and say, maybe it's okay for me to be uncomfortable. Let me learn more about that. So I think it really is just a pawn that's used to cultivate fear, and fear, frankly, wins elections. And we've got to somehow change the way we do our politics so that fear is not the controlling factor, but issues that are substantive and things that are going to bring us higher and go further are the things that we talk about.
All right.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I love what Tyler was saying, and he was talking about this idea of fear. And if we just take a deep breath and think about it, there is no reason to fear the facts, right? So what teachers and schools, what they want to actually teach your child are the facts. However, what has happened with this is that instilling fear is just the instilling fear into this whole conversation is exactly what Tyler said. It is just a way to divide, a sort of a divide and conquer kind of thing, because what schools are trying to teach your kids is nothing to be afraid of. It's not the big bad wolf. It is not that. What's being tossed around just doesn't even exist really. It's like made up. And that is a little scary.
That's what goes
Yeah.
back to somebody that I quoted earlier said, if we don't talk about this and we don't present facts, whether we're uncomfortable or not, people are listening to the loudest voices.
Right.
And it doesn't mean that those loudest voices are correct, but they're heard. So we have to find a way to be heard. And one way to do that is through who we elect, right? Who we put in office. We're talking about legislation, who we put in the school board positions. You know, these are critical times and critical topics, and the people that are going to represent us are either going to take us forward, learning from our mistakes, or they're going to keep us in a place where we don't know. So
Yeah, you know what, Janet, you say something that's really important, and I think that one thing that is really important is this idea that state legislators, national legislators, that they are dipping into how local districts, you know, and what local districts teach and how they teach our children. And I don't think, you know, I don't want my child's education to be determined by some person who lives in Jeff City or Topeka and has no idea and is not in my community and doesn't understand how we live in our community. And I don't think that they should be the ones making decisions for, you know, how curriculums are set and what students are learning on the ground in my community. That's why we have local school boards, right? To help make those decisions, because as Tyler was saying before, they're closer to the people. They're closer to the people. And so I think that's an issue too that should be discussed, is who determines how curriculums are set. And Tyler probably knows a lot more about that than I do, but I think that's also a very important issue as well.
Well, I think it kind of goes to a point too that, you know, if people aren't scared of the concept that's being tossed around there, maybe they just don't think it applies to them. Like, you know, so if we look at the census of the state of Kansas, 6% of our population is Black. Okay, so some of our folks are like, this just doesn't even apply to my community. It doesn't need to be there because I don't have these issues. And, you know, I think what the notorious RBG would say on that is, you know, it's kind of like having an umbrella in the middle of a rainstorm and you put it away because you're not getting wet. You know, that's where we're at, I think, with this issue. This is an issue. And just because we're not maybe getting wet right now doesn't mean that we need to put away our umbrella. It is an issue that we have to address. And I think some of this like suppression of these kinds of ideas and thoughts and this part of our history only speaks to the fact that we don't want to deal with some of those things that make us uncomfortable.
Well, absolutely. And certainly we know that just because you might live in Oshkosh B'gosh or in a small community where there are no people of color, doesn't mean that your children are not going to live in a world where there's plenty of people of color.
Exactly.
Right? So they might end up, are you going to limit them to, you have to stay here in this bubble because we're not getting wet, you know, instead of taking this umbrella and going out into the rain and exploring the rest of the world. I mean, so yeah, I mean, it may not be impacting you today, but your children will certainly live in a world where that is impacted by these kinds of things. And so it is important to all of us. And how I vote on my side of town, and the town next to me and the town next to me definitely is going to impact you in some way, right? So if we're talking about voting for state lawmakers or national lawmakers, and the better we understand each other and how we live, the more likely we are going to agree on who should be our leaders, who our leadership should be, and get leadership that works for all of us, right?
Right.
And not just a few.
You know, redistricting, Connie Taylor's on this call and she's heading our redistricting team. But that's really important because a lot of the history of trampled rights, Tyler, you referred to that, it goes to the way our districts are drawn, right? And who's representing us. So once again, the league is providing opportunities for people to know who is signing the pledges, who is trying to redistrict and change, the voters instead of the voters changing who represents us. So these are all topics that you keep peeling back the layers of CRT and it goes really deep. And sometimes people say, what can I do about this? You know, it's too rooted. It's too rooted in our country. And what you're saying is take action,
Right.
to elect the right school board people, talk to the school board people, talk to the State Board of Education, talk to the legislators and say, we want this for our children, right?
Absolutely. I mean, Janet, where we live, has been legislated and is rooted in trampled rights, right? I mean,
Yes.
Tyler, I think you mentioned, you talk about redlining, and how that, the master of that right here in the KC metro area. And so that dictated, where people were allowed to live. And that idea of fear of another people because of your ignorance of another people allowed that to happen. And if you just take that one subject, that if we knew better about the truth about one another and understood one another from the beginning, or at least those many years ago, 40, 50, 60 years ago, could redlining have taken hold? I sometimes try to imagine, I play a game with myself and I try to imagine, what if there was never slavery? What if there was never slavery, that Black people came to this country on a completely equal footing with white people, and that we always just work together to grow the best vegetables, build the best homes, the best banks? What if there was never slavery? It was never instilled in people that any one people was less than the other. Where would we be today? And what would this country be like today?
That sounds like heaven, That sounds like what heaven might be like. I've been reading a book called Stamped from the Beginning. And, and they just talk about, how this is an instilled part of America. And we're ashamed of it, most likely. Many are ashamed of it. And they don't know what to say. They're kind of embarrassed. So instead, they just try to push it off. And going back to Senator Karen Tyson, she also, the one introducing a bill to ban CRT, she said that we need to make sure race is not an issue and that people are not judged by the color of their skin. But to me, that's saying that legislation does make a race an issue. So where do you fall on that? I think I know, but I'm still going to ask the question.
Well, race has always been an issue. It was,
Yep.
you can't, it's just ridiculous. It's just like I say, I hate when people say, I don't see color. Well, if you don't see color, then you don't see me, right? I am a Black woman. It's like looking at me and saying, I don't see gender. Well, yeah, you do. So you can't say that we don't want race to be an issue. Race is always an issue. Of course it is. It was an issue from the beginning. We just have to understand it better. We just have to not be uncomfortable to talk about race. It's okay to be uncomfortable. And you can't ignore it. That is not, That is not going to make it go away. Saying you don't see color is not going to make me less color. It's just not going to happen, and it's okay to say, hey, Marae, talk to me about maybe how I grew up, and is that different? I mean, it is an issue. I just think it's asinine to say that. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think you had the quote of the day, Marae, with, hey, the fear of other folks based on your ignorance of them, right? I mean, that's what it comes down to, being so fearful of folks because you're so ignorant of what it is there. And I don't think ignorance is always, ignorance sounds bad. It means you just but saying that racism is not an issue doesn't make it not an issue. Saying, teen suicide is not an issue doesn't make teen suicide not an issue. I love your mental thought there of what would it look like if Black folks would have come to America in the same way that white folks did. And I think Robin DiAngelo in her work, on privilege speaks a lot to that and says, we have made race such a binary thing. I'm either a racist or I'm not. And racism is bad and not being racist is good. So I don't want to be bad. So I'm not racist. That means racism doesn't exist in me. And she asked this question, well, if that's the fact, if that's true, then why does racial hierarchies still exist? Why do racial hierarchies persist? When we say that racism is bad and being a non-racist is good, well, it means that there's something else out there that we've got to address. And if we're not willing to address it, then we're not going to solve the problem. So just like I said, shoving it under a rug, sweeping it under a rug, whatever analogy you want to have there, it's not going to fix the problem because it is a problem.
Yeah. I like hearing people, people hate to be called racist. Obviously nobody wants to be called racist, right? But what about, okay, if we started saying, you may not be racist, but you are ignorant or you are not in the know, right? I think that's more of the problem because like I said, I've said many times, of course there are racists in this country. I'm not saying that at all, but what I am saying that is so many people who may say or do things that are considered racist, they don't do them because they don't want to do better, right? They just don't know better. They're just and it's sometimes hard for people who are of a certain intellect not to understand that because it's like, well, there's so many books out there. Well, there's so much information out there. How can you possibly be ignorant? But there is a huge segment of our country that they don't read or they can't read or they don't have the access, and we have to understand that as well. And so I am really open to people who ask me questions. I know a lot of African Americans are saying, I don't want to be your teacher or your educator.
Yeah.
I know that is said too. And that's okay. But if I can educate, I respect the person who asks because that's the person who wants to be better and wants to learn more, not the person who says, oh, this doesn't exist. I don't, it's not in my world, so it doesn't exist.
I took a class on this subject and some of the Black participants in the class said, I'm so tired of you asking me to explain racism. Do your homework, people. That was a comment a refrain that I heard quite a lot. I have a question about Marae and Tyler, you both probably know about this. So in those states where critical race theory or some, whatever they call it, is passed, how is that enforced? So if there's legislation saying you can't teach critical race theory, which some might say that means no Black history, which is wrong, how do they enforce it?
I think they have tattletellers.
They have what?
I think they have people who tattletale. Who tattletale. In other words, I'm in a classroom, and if I'm in a classroom as a student and, some certain thing is discussed, right? And so there's that famous question that moms and dads always ask when kids come home from school: what did you learn in school today? You know, and I start talking to my parent or whomever, and they go, well, that's critical race theory. I'm gonna, hey, this teacher is teaching critical race theory. I mean, it has to be reported from the classroom out, right? Because legislators are not in the classroom, and the enforcement, or like we talked about this a little bit ago, the penalty is a potential sanction for a school district or a school. So like anything else, kids today go home and tell mom and dad what they learned in school. They may not be opposed to that, the student I mean, but if the parent reports them, then yeah, it could be detrimental. Do you know other beyond that, Tyler?
I don't know. And I think it's early enough now. We really don't know exactly what the ramifications are going to be.
Right.
And I think one of the things about some of those loosely based laws and those kind of things are some things probably aren't real enforceable, because sometimes I don't know if they're passed because they want to enforce them. They want to pass them because they want to get a vote. And that's a really kind of, political way of looking at it. But I'm going to think that if I can go back to my home district, and this really didn't cost me anything, but I got it passed, and I'm going to get reelected. Sometimes that's worth it, even if it doesn't really do anything to change the way things are done or what standards are there. So I think we got to be careful about that too, because it could just be a political football that's being passed around as well.
That's trickery. I think that's trickery. I mean, that's getting my vote through trickery. That's
sure. It is, but it's a hot button issue, right? So rather than talk about something that's substantive, something that a new tax that's needed or whatever, I'm going to throw this out there. I'm going to put it on my postcard, and I'm going to send out an email that says, CRT is bad, and if you vote for me, I'm not going to support CRT. What's that mean? Probably a whole lot of nothing, but it gets people fired up. It gets them to the polls, and I get elected. Mm-hmm. I think that's the real motivation behind this particular issue for a lot of folks. Not for everybody, but I think for a lot of folks, it's a vote grab.
Somebody asked, is this related to a particular political party, or is this general politicking?
There's no doubt the more conservative wing is the wing that's using the CRT as a way to get supporters, and I don't think that either side is immune from using hot button issues in inappropriate ways. So I'll be real open about that. But I think on this particular issue, it's certainly a further right audience, a further conservative audience that seems to be using it in a way to create fear and cultivate votes against it.
Thank you. So we kind of already talked about the vagueness of the legislation. And you have anything to add on that, Mari? Sorry, I'm choking all of a sudden. The danger of the vagueness.
Yeah, I mean, you're right, Janet. We did talk about this a little bit, and the vagueness. The legislation is written so broadly and so vaguely that it can be interpreted in so many ways. And the danger there is that, because it is not very specific, and I think it's not specific because those writing the legislation don't have a clear understanding themselves. And I think that goes back to what Tyler was doing. It may not be because it was really something that is wanting to enforce, but rather a vote grab. But it is so broad and so vague that it can be interpreted in so many ways and encompass so much of our history, because we know that our history, it's like and this has been used as a description many times, like a quilt, right? It's all wound up together. And if you pull one thread out, the whole thing begins to unravel. And that is a scary situation, in that once you start talking about not being able to talk about any people who are oppressed by any people, it encompasses so much of our history. And and so it is a very, very dangerous, loosely, vaguely written piece of legislation. Not that I want to see it any more specific. I just,
That's a good correction.
but it's almost like it encompasses. It's like they're just, throwing dice. Let's throw it out there, a big old blanket, and cover every single thing. And that makes you wonder, do they really know what they're talking about too, when something is that broad and that vague? I know as a writer, sometimes, when I find myself writing something and I have so much information and I'm not able to hone it in and to be clear on a specific topic, that means I need to do a little bit more research and reporting, because I really don't understand the issue that I'm trying to write about, because I'm just throwing out this blanket of all this stuff. And that's kind of how I see this legislation.
Tyler, you have anything to add to that?
I don't think I have anything to really add to that, Janet. I have other things that we want to definitely talk about. So maybe let's go there, because I know we're getting to the 10:05, 10:07 era. So,
yeah.
So I'll just turn it back to you, Janet, and then see what you want to do next. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we'll do one more question from a prepared question that we talked about before, and then we'll take some from our participants. So in Kansas, there has been an outcry from parents who do not want their child to be taught critical race theory. Tyler, you kind of intimated that people may be manipulated by political rhetoric. But if politicians say critical race theory is a bad thing, some people may take their word for it at face value. So what do we do in the schools to counter that? How do we calm down these parents? What are some practical things we could do to reassure our parents that this is a good thing for their child?
The answer to that, I don't think, is a simple one, because I think, like Murray said, we're trying to cure ignorance. Okay, we're trying to shine the light on something that doesn't have a lot of light shown on it right now. So I think the first thing we've got to do, and Murray has mentioned this, we have to read. We need to do some study and investigation before you assume that the curriculum has something in it that you don't like. Go to the curriculum and find out. Like I said earlier, it's not fun reading, but it's not hard reading. It's not arcane. It's right there in black and white. Go and read it. It's not scary when you read it. And I think we have to do this. I think we have to stop feeling like we have to be entertained all the time. And politics has gotten to be a version of entertainment. Well, we have to stop thinking that just because that I need to be entertained. When it comes to issues that are complex, like racism and sexism and all of these kind of things, it's not going to be an entertainment session. It's not a Netflix show. It's something that you have to dig into, study, and think about. And if we have reduced things that are complex to little memes or little cartoons, that's probably indicative that we need to do some further study on it. So I really think that what parents need to do is what they're advocating for their kids to happen in schools. They need to educate themselves, and educating themselves means they read, means they listen to a diverse perspective, and that they don't think they have to be entertained, that they actually have to do the hard work and figure out what's going on out there.
I completely agree with what Tyler is saying, that parents have a responsibility to understand what it is they are advocating for or against, and to not take anybody's word for what this issue is, that they, if otherwise, you know, because if you don't, you're out there making noise and screaming. You have to ask yourself, why is it that why would I not want this thing taught? What is this thing and why might I not want it taught? And I think that if you just ask yourselves those questions, what is this thing really? Read the legislation. See what it is that is being proposed. The legislation, while reading a curriculum is really boring, it could be, but trust me, I've read enough. But reading this legislation is not that. It's pretty easy. It's a few pages. I think it's 3 pages. It is not that. Read what is being proposed, right? And then ask yourself, do I not want this taught to my child? And why don't I want this taught to my child? 3 questions. And I think if more people did that, if parents did that, they would come away thinking a lot differently about this issue than they maybe do think. It's easy to follow the crowd, right? Because Joe next door says, I am so mad about this critical race theory. I'm going right down to the school board and I'll come with you and I'll come with you, but you really haven't done the work. That's another term we throw around a lot today. It's like, I'm going to do better. I'm going to do the work. Well, first you have to know what the work is before you can say that you're going to do the work so that you can do it. And in this case, the work is a simple read of the legislation and a simple asking yourself of some questions about, why do I not support this? What is it that I really want my kids to be taught? What is it that my kids are being taught? So, and if you understand the answer, if you can answer those questions, that's what you can do to make sure that you're not being, and I love this word, I'm so glad I'm getting to use it, you're not being hoodwinked, right? Because we don't want to be hoodwinked.
Hoodwinked. Okay. Hoodwinked. Look for it printed in the Kansas City Star on one of Marae's articles. So speaking of reading, we've been asked, what are some books or titles you'd recommend for students? What are some books that you're personally reading to get yourselves up to speed on this? I mentioned Stamped from the Beginning, How to Be an Anti-Racist, The Color of Law. These are some of mine. What are some of the books that you two are reading or have read? You can put them in the chat, and you could just tell us recommend 1 or 2.
If it's easier, I'll be happy to post in the chat, and I recommend all the ones that you mentioned there, Janet. I think Robin DiAngelo does a really good job of explaining privilege, so I appreciate her work on this topic. So that would be one that I'd add to your list for sure.
Yeah, I mean, the book Caste is a hard read, but it is an amazing book. And at least for parents, I recommend that everybody read Caste. It's a fabulous book. And I just happen to I picked this up the other day and I'm reading this here. It's called Manufacturing Hate. It's a Milton Alamati book, and it's really good. It's very easy read, a quick read. And I can post some others that I've read and that I am reading in the chat too as well.
In Kansas City, there's a tour, virtual, I think it's an app you can get, that you can take a tour of the red line districts in Kansas City. Have either of you ever done that? Marae, are you familiar with that?
No, I have not done that, but I did several years ago. I wrote a story, and I believe it was Shawnee Mission East. They had a teacher there. He's no longer there, David Muhammad, who had a group of students in Shawnee Mission East at the time. I think they only had like 25 Black kids in the entire school. So there weren't very many. But what they did was they had this tour that they would do with their students once a year or twice a year. They would take them into Kansas City and do exactly what you're talking about, show them the redlining and talk to them about how those lines came apart. They would drive down the Paseo and then drive down Ward Parkway. And one of the things he told me that the kids would notice that, hey, really, these are virtually the same boulevard, but one is on this side and one is on that side. And you can see the difference in the development of those boulevards and the housing that's out there, even though they're structured very similar. So I haven't done that, but I know that some of the schools are doing it. Now, is that CRT?
Uh,
Yeah.
I'm not going to answer that. How about that? Here's a question. Are there examples of critical race theory being taught well? So that's Shawnee Mission. That would be one example, I guess.
I mean,
And
that could be an example, but then I would argue that it's not CRT. It's just simply it's just history. It's showing you how various aspects of our history, what it looks like today. Because of this, we have this, and that's not CRT, but it is the kind of thing that is being people are being told is CRT, but it's not CRT.
That is a key point, Martin. That is a key point, because, you know, we have put Black history, BIPOC history, and said that's CRT. It's not. It's not. That's history. And CRT says, well, how has that history impacted the way we make our laws? And that's a very thorough study that happens in JD schools. It does not happen in high school. You know, in a high school government class, we're trying to figure out how we make laws according to the Constitution. The nuances of how the experiences and the thoughts and the backgrounds of those who make those laws may impact the way those laws are written, that is something that's far beyond a typical high school student's ability to even understand. That's something that takes years of study. So I just want to echo what you just said there, because who's doing CRT well? I don't know. It's taught mainly in law schools, and the founder was from Harvard, so I'm assuming they probably do some things with it. But you know, I mean, that's part of the problem, is that CRT is being lumped in with, well, I can't talk about the history of Black people. Folks, that's not good. That's not good. That's suppression all over again.
I just want to add to that, but I would argue that while this whole description I gave about Shawnee Mission East is not CRT, I would also argue that we do need to teach our students that, for example, you know, our forefathers who sat down to write, you know, the Declaration of Independence, you know, that all men are created equal and we have certain inalienable rights, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, right? All those guys who sat down, those men, because that's who they were, those white men who sat down and wrote that, and I don't think it was their intent, but when they sat down to write that, at the very moment they were writing it, many of them were slave owners themselves. So yeah, I think the kids should know that, and then and ask that question. Now, is that CRT? I don't think so. I think that is just our history. That when those words were written, the men who wrote those words actually bought and sold human beings, yet they wrote that all men are created equal. That raises some great questions for conversation in a high school classroom, a diverse high school classroom, right? And that's where we should be with our education. That, you know, stimulate our minds and talk about our history, Black history, and the intersection of Black history and white history, because Black history in this country is nothing more than American history.
Yeah, and I think the fear that, so, you know, what you just brought up there, it causes that fear, right? You're going to tell me that George Washington was a bad person because racism is bad. So George Washington was bad? No, I'm saying that George Washington grew up in a time where that was the norm, and that's going to impact his thoughts. It doesn't mean that what they created doesn't have potential to be great. That's the beauty of our country, right? Is they planted seeds that then prospered. So I think that, you know, that's the big fear, right? You're now labeling for one way and then gonna discount them, right? That's not what we're saying, but we are saying this. You got to think about it. You got to that into account.
Right, and we're not labeling them at all.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's the fact. That is just pure.
It's just a fact.
fact.
We counted a person as a 3/5 of an individual.
Right.
That's our compromise.
That's
That we didn't even see them as a 5/5. We saw them as 3/5.
right.
That's going to have ramifications over time. It's going to impact that's going to cloud our thinking.
Absolutely. And you cannot ignore that. And because if you ignore that, you don't understand how we got where we are today and why we're still, having this very conversation this morning is because of what happened in 1950, 1954, 1863, and so forth, 1654, and so forth. So, yeah, I think it's a beautiful thing to be able to bring up, to create conversations like that among young people, and what we can learn from them by listening to those conversations. We do them a disservice and ourselves a disservice. And as far as I'm concerned, we do the patriotism of this country a disservice if we ignore the depths of our history.
I have one more question, and it said recently we've had an outpouring of racist and sensitive incidents in Kansas City area. How should we address these incidents, and what do you think is the root cause that they're happening now? So that answer to that question should take us right till the end here. What do you think?
Well, I would say that, those kind of things have probably been happening, and now they're just maybe getting some attention, but those kinds of things have been happening forever. So, and the fact that they're getting attention now doesn't mean that they're any worse today than they were yesterday. They're all bad, and we need to handle them, I think, through constant attention and education about how these things are creating division in our society and keeping people from the best versions of themselves. So I'm not trying to figure out what the thought behind the question might be. It might be, because we're shining still light on it, does that mean it's spawning more things? I don't know, but here's what I do know is that we have an issue and that we need to address it, and not addressing it doesn't make it any better. So I would say that if these things are bringing the attention out, that these thoughts and ideas are out there, then that just is an opportunity for us to get better.
Yeah, I'm not sure what spawned the question either, but I will say that I do agree with you, Tyler, that these are not things that just are suddenly happening. I do think that because we are in this, and I like to put quotes up, this reckoning with race, and that there is a lot of conversation about race. The more we talk about race, the more we recognize the mistakes that are being made, and so that there may be more awareness to it because we're suddenly more attuned to listening for it, right? Before we weren't listening as closely and as intently as we are today. And I think that that's a good thing. That doesn't mean there's more of it. It just means that we are more aware of it and we are more sensitive to it. And because we're more sensitive to it, we can address it. Before, when you're it's just like numbing the pain. If you crack a bone in your leg and you take medication, right, to numb it so that you don't feel it, then you're likely to do more damage to it, right? If you feel the pain, and then you can start doing things that will heal that as opposed to ignoring it. And so I do think it is a good thing that we're aware of some of these instances that are happening. I also think that with education, that if students understood the pain they were causing, they really understood what was behind some of the things they're saying or doing, they might not be so keen to do those things and say those things, so that more education, not less education, is needed. And I think that is the answer. The more we educate, it's like drawing pus out of something. The more you get it out, draw it out, the cleaner it becomes, right? And I think that that's where we are as a country. So it is a good thing that we're noticing these things. Not a good thing that they're happening, but a good thing that we're noticing them, that we're more in tune to them, and that we're more conscious of them, and that we're more apt to try to find solutions for them, because now we see and hear them.
So we're running out of time here. I just want to ask you both, do you think we accomplished something today by talking about critical race theory?
I do. I think based on the questions that came from people, that they were engaged, that they want to learn, and hopefully, it's the each one teach one phenomenon occurs, that if people learn something from what Tyler and I and you, Janet, had to say today, maybe they will go to their next get together with their friends and say, hey, I heard this conversation and this is what I learned, and they will spread it, and the next will spread it, and the next will spread it. I do think that we accomplished something because people were listening and they were engaged, and that's how, see, my culture, it was the power of the word. We spread stories by telling stories, right? And so, I think that that's what is happening here today. At least I hope so.
Absolutely. I think anytime that we can listen, that we can talk, that we can share, that we can do things in a way that, we're vulnerable enough to say, hey, look, I don't understand this. Explain more about this to me. I hear about this. Tell me more about it. I think anytime that we can go deeper than a meme on social media or something that's tossed out there intentionally to incite a reaction and an immediate reaction, either an action of anger, of fear, anytime that we can take that and have a substantive topic, a conversation about it, I think that's a better thing. And I think so. I've had RBG on my mind a lot because KU did a lecture on that the other day, and one of my favorite quotes that she had was, she quoted MLK on this. The arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice, and she adds to that, but only if there is a steadfast commitment to see the task through to completion. And if we don't recognize that we have not seen this task through to completion, we miss an opportunity to grow. So I hope we all take that opportunity to do that.
Well, I've got to tell you both, I think you are marvelous, marvelous speakers. I've learned so much. Can't thank you enough. I'm sure everybody that's on the call is applauding for you right now. So I will send you on your way to enjoy the rest of your day, and just with very heartfelt thanks. And we'll turn it over to Amber now.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Yes, thanks again to Murray and Tyler for just taking the time to be with us and share with us the many nuances related to this discussion. And thank you to Janet for all of your work on the program and for stepping in again as moderator. You do such a fine job creating an engaging discussion. Again, our hope for all of you attending is that you will use what you learned today to inform conversations with elected officials and decisions at the ballot box. Next, I'd like to introduce Janine Lenane, who is leading our DEI team along with Kay Healy. As you know, our organization has embarked on a mission to become more inclusive and welcoming. Part of this journey involves encouraging people to increase their understanding of equity, diversity, and inclusivity, and examining their power and privilege. You may have noticed the new hashtag DEI moment feature in our newsletter and emails. This is part of our DEI Teens action plan for the coming year to keep DEI front and center in our work. So today, Janine is here to share our first program-related DEI moment. Janine, thank you. I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, I think my audio is working, so it is. So today we're going to talk about cultural appropriation, and this will be a very quick discussion, but basically cultural appropriation is the adoption typically without acknowledgement of cultural identity markers from subcultures or minorities. So it's the dominant culture taking elements usually out of context and using them either for profit or in ways that they were not originally intended from another culture that doesn't have the power necessarily to take that information back. And so for the example, I'm using sugar skulls, which are part of Day of the Dead celebration. And you're probably seeing a lot of these. These are actual sugar skulls from Mexico. But you're probably starting to see a lot of these as Halloween decorations come out, even though the holiday is adjacent to, but not Halloween. Halloween, both of them deal with spirits and tangentially for Halloween with death, but they approach it in very different ways. Day of the Dead is a 2-day celebration that has roots in Aztec ceremonies and then was incorporated into Catholic practices, specifically in Mexico, although it appears in variations throughout Central and Latin America. And it is a celebration of deceased loved ones and family members. And you will see the sugar skulls, you will see ofertas, which are altars with pictures of the deceased and their favorite food, and it's a welcoming the spirits in. And these skulls can be placed on the ofertas, or they can be given to friends as a gift, and it's kind of a mocking eating of death. It's laughing in death's face. And I should note that I am not of Mexican descent, so I know about this, but I don't know about it in depth. But what you are starting to see are these sugar skulls popping up in out of context ways, as pumpkin decorations, as decorations on cups at Starbucks or cookies, or things that take them out of context and used for profit by people who normally don't. Sorry, I've got a little one in the background. Mommy, I love you. I love you too, honey. Shh. I'm gonna hide, Mama. Shh. Please, Ash. Sorry. But they are being used for profit by people outside of the culture. Now, this doesn't mean that you can't learn about this or participate, but I hear you. But the big thing is to think about who is profiting from this. So if you were to say buy a sugar skull, are you buying it from a large multi-billion-dollar company? Or are you buying it from somebody from that culture who's directly profiting from it? You see this all across the board. You see it in hairstyles, you see it in jewelry. And the idea is not to not use this information or not to incorporate these things and learn about them, but to do it in a respectful manner that you make sure that the people who originated it are the ones profiting and are the ones that you are honoring with it. There's a world of difference between, like I said, buying from a small artisan versus buying from a multinational corporation. So with this, normally if we were in person, we would ask you to turn to your neighbors and kind of have a discussion about what you think cultural appropriation is and how it functions, but we're not. In the follow-up email, what you will find are some articles about cultural appropriation, specifically dealing with Day of the Dead and sugar skulls, some information about Day of the Dead, and also links to community, and I see Mary's post, links to community celebrations like the one at Mattie Rhodes that are in the communities, designed by these communities, that you can go and you can participate and learn in a respectful and inclusive manner instead of taking in cultural appropriation. And that is my presentation.
That was great. Thank you, Janine. Really appreciate the work that you're doing and just for making time for us. I know you're very busy and it's Saturday morning. So, and like she said, I will include a lot of additional resources you can pursue on your own in the follow-up email. Next, we have Connie Taylor, our redistricting champion, and she's going to share a brief update about the working group and our redistricting efforts. And Connie's going to share her screen, Mitchell. Thank you. Connie, you need to unmute.
Thank you. Thank you so much for Amber and the opportunity to continue the conversation about redistricting. Let me get this set here. So this morning we've heard our panelists talk about community choosing our legislators instead of them choosing the voters, and the loudest voices being heard. Those three things are the heart of people-powered fair maps. And the conversations around CRT impacts the way redistricting will take place, not only for the state legislature, but also for the State Board of Education districts, as well as your local school boards. So it's time to stand up and speak out, and we need your voices to be heard with redistricting. That's why we're asking you to take the following steps. Request the League's assistance to map your community of interest. Normally we meet the first and third Thursday of the month via Zoom. However, we can accommodate your schedule. There's a Google request form here, and I will copy this into the chat. And then write your state legislators. We're asking you on two specific things with the state legislators. Ask them to contact their leadership regarding additional town halls and adopting the guidelines. The leadership promised additional town halls this fall. Ask them to come through with that promise. And then we're asking you to ask your legislators to allow for public comment prior to the redistricting maps being finalized. And then I will post this link in the chat for you as well. Tiffany had a question about redistricting. Redistricting is the process of the various elected bodies redrawing district boundaries. So it's who's going to be on your ballot for congressional district, your state house district, your state senate district, and it goes down to the local level for your county commissioner, your city council, and your school board. So it's who's going to be appearing on your ballot in the next 10 years. So thank you again for this opportunity. Just continue to put forth the effort to really challenge the legislature to adopt guidelines and to make your voice heard.
Great. Thank you so much, Connie, for keeping us updated and for leading our campaign for fair maps. We appreciate all that you and your team are doing to fight for fair maps and showing us how we can take part in the process. Our work is only possible because of our members. And Mitchell, if you'll display the last slide. Great, thank you. This slide shows all the wonderful people who have joined this year. I want to thank them and all of our members who believe in our mission to build a more perfect democracy. Also, I want to thank Eileen Manza and Victoria Smith and our incredible membership team on reaching its goal of 45 new members before March 2022, 6 months early. We are so grateful to them for their hard work. And if you would like to learn more about becoming a member, you can do so at our website, LWVJoCo.org. Before we close, I want to encourage you to join us for our discussion in November 6th, about the pivotal role of water. And you can also register for this on our website, LWVJoCo.org. Thanks everyone for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Thanks.